Dear students, welcome to my classroom of Modern History of China. Today, I am going to discuss Chinese literature in its modern sense. We are here to explore the Chinese literature which is influenced with the Western ideas as well as soaked in the traditional Chinese nationalism. Let's have a journey to the Chinese literature that will help you to understand the ideals which helped to a great extent to establish modern China. Following the overthrow of the Qing dynasty and the establishment of the Republic in 1911-12, many young intellectuals turned their attention to the overhauling of literary traditions, beginning with the language itself. In January 1917, an article by Hu Shi, a student of philosophy at Columbia University, entitled, I'm telling you here the translation from Chinese, that is, Tentative Proposal for Literary Reform, was published in Xingqing, that means New Youth, a radical monthly magazine published in Beijing. In it, Yu called for a new national literature, written not in the classical language but in the vernacular, the living national language, Goyu. Chen Duxiu, the editor of Xingqing, supported Hu's views in his own article. I'm telling you the translation from Chinese, that is on literary revolution, which emboldened Yu to hone his arguments further in a second article which was published in 1918, and the name of that article is Constructive Literary Revolution, in which he spelled out his formula for a literary renaissance. The literary reform movement that began with this and other calls to arms was an important part of the larger new culture movement for cultural and socio-political reform, which was greatly strengthened by a student protest on May 4, 1919, against the intellectual performance of the Chinese delegates to the Paris Peace Conference, formally terminating First World War. At the outset, the literary reformers met with impassioned but mostly futile opposition from classical literati such as the renowned translator Lin Su, who would largely give up the battle within a few years. The first fruits of this movement were seen in 1918 and 1919 with the appearance in Xingqing or such stories as Kuang Green Rizi. The translation would be from Chinese to English, The Diary of a Madman, a Gogol-inspired piece about a madman who suspects that he alone is sane and the rest of the world is mad. And Your Medicine, both by Zhou Shuren, known by the pseudonym Lu Zhan. Zhu had studied in Japan, and with his younger brother, the noted essayist Zhu Zuren, had become the leader of the literary revolution soon after returning to China. Lu Zun's acerbic, somewhat westernized, and often satirical attacks on China's feudalistic traditions established him as China's foremost critic and writer. His A.Q. Jiangzuan, if I go for the English translation, that is 1921, The True Story of A.H.Q., a damning critic of early 20th century conservatism in China, is the representative work of the May 4th period and has become an international classic. The early writings provided the impetus for a number of youthful intellectuals to pool their resources and promote shared ideals by forming literary associations. In 1920, Shen Yanbin, better known later as Mao Dun, and others established the Zunzu Yanzui or Literary Research Association, generally referred to as the Realist or Art for Life's Sake School, which paved the way for coming of another literary magazine which was known as Short Story Monthly, if I go for the English translation. Perhaps the most important literary magazine of the early 1920s, Jiasuo Yaobao, was used by the association to promote the so-called new literature. Most major fiction writers publishing their works in it throughout the 1920s, until the magazine's headquarters was destroyed by Japanese bombs in 1932. The socially reflective, critical realist writing that characterized this group held sway in China well into the 1940s, when it was gradually eclipsed by more didactic, propagandistic literature. So here we are trying to understand the transformation from 1918 onwards, like how the Chinese, they started a cultural movement which was very much pragmatic, and it was against of the social vices which they used to have in the traditional regime. And also their ideas were very much politicized, and this change was definitely an outcome of their interaction with the Western civilization. So they were trying to adopt the Western values and enlightenment in the context of Chinese tradition, where they were also trying to keep in mind that they had to respect their own values, their own tradition, and also to have an exposure to the Western world to broaden their ideas and also to develop their intellectual thinking. Members of the smaller Zhuang Zhao Shi Creation Society, on the other hand, were followers of the Romantic tradition, where we find that they were thinking it was the responsibility by the writers, referring to their work as art for art's sake. That means they were giving emphasis on how to make literature artistic and how to promote literature as an art for art's sake. In 1924, however, the society's leading figure, Guo Moreau, converted to Marxism, and the Creation Society evolved into China's first Marxist literary society. Much of the energy of members of both associations were expanded in translating literature of other cultures, which largely replaced traditional Chinese literature as the foundation upon which the new literature was built. This was particularly true in drama and poetry, in which figures such as Norwegian dramatist Henrik Ibsen and Bengali poet Rabindranath Tagore, respectively, were as well known to Chinese readers as indigenous playwrights and poets. In drama, the Nongyoshi South China Society, founded by the former creationist Tian Han, produced and performed several short plays that were a mixture of critical realism and melodrama, while poets of the Xingyu Shi, if I go for the English translation, then it would be Crescent Moon Society, such as the British-educated Zhu Zimo and the American-educated Wan Yidu, were creating new forms based on Western models, introducing the beauty of music and color into their extremely popular lyrical verse. Now I would like to give you an idea about the growth and development of modern Chinese literature from 1927 to 37. Political events of the mid-1920s, in which nationalist, communist and warlord forces clashed frequently, initiated a shift to the left in Chinese letters, culminating in 1930 in the founding of the Jiuzhuzhia Lianming, that means League of Left-Wing Writers, whose membership included many influential writers. Lu Xun, the prime organizer and titular head throughout the League's half-decade of activities, had stopped writing fiction in late 1925, and after moving from Beijing to Shanghai in 1927, directed most of his creative energies to translating Russian literature and writing the bitingly satirical random essays that became his trademark. Among the many active pre-war novelists, the most successful were Mao Dun, Lao Shi, and Ba Xin. Now I have a quiz for you. Who was one of the most successful novelists in China during the period from 1927 to 1937? You have 4 options. Number 1 is Karl Marx, number 2 is Chiang Kai-shek, number 3 is Sun Yat-sen, and number 4 is Mao Dun. The right answer is option 4, that is Mao Dun. Mao Dun was the prototypical realist. The subjects of his socially mimetic tableaux included pre-May 4th urban intellectual circles, bankrupt rural villages, and in perhaps his best-known work, Zai, which was published in 1933, and the English translation would be Midnight. Metropolitan Shanghai, in all its financial and social chaos during the post-Depression era, all are what I can say the examples of his literary excellence. Lao Shi, modern China's foremost humorist, whose early novels were written while he was teaching Chinese in London, was deeply influenced by traditional Chinese storytellers and the novels of Charles Dickens. His works are known for their episodic structure, racy northern dialect, vivid characterizations, and abundant humor. Yet it was left to him to write modern China's classic novel, the moving tale of the gradual degeneration of a seemingly incorruptible denizen of China's lower depths, which was published in English as a translation known as Rickshaw Boy, and that was published in the year 1945. Ba Xin, the prominent anarchist, was the most popular novelist of the period. A prolific writer, he is known primarily for his autobiographical novel Zia, that means the family, which traces the lives and varied fortunes of the 3 sons of a wealthy, powerful family. The book is a revealing portrait of China's oppressive patriarchal society, as well as of the awakening of China's youth to the urgent need for social revolution. The 1930s also witnessed the meteoric rise of a group of novelists from northeast China, Manchuria, who were driven south by the Japanese annexation of their homeland in 1932. The sometimes rousing, sometimes nostalgic novels of Xiao Zun and Xiao Hong and the powerful short stories of Dunamo Hongyang Liang became rallying cries for anti-Japanese youth as signs of impending war mounted. Poetry of the 1930s underwent a similar politicization as more and more students returned from overseas to place their pens in the service of the people's resistance against feudalism and imperialism. The lyrical verse of the early crescent moon poets was replaced by a more socially conscious poetry by the likes of Ai Qing, Tian Zian, and Zhang Kezia that appealed to the reader's patriotic fervor. Others, particularly those who had at first gravitated toward the crescent moon society, began striking out in various directions. Notable works of those authors include the contemplative sonnets of Feng Zi, the urban songs of Beijing by Bian Zilin, and the romantic verses of He Kuifang. Less popular but more daring were Dai Wangsu and Li Jinfa. Poets published in Xiandai Contemporary Age, a Shanghai literary magazine. The latter wrote very sophisticated, yet frequently baffling poetry in the manner of the French symbolists. While fiction regained supreme in the 1930s, as the art of the short story was mastered by growing numbers of May 4th writers and novels were coming into their own. Probably the most spectacular advances were made in drama, largely through the efforts of a single playwright. Although realistic social drama written in the vernacular had made its appearance in China long before the 1930s, primarily as translations or adaptations of Western works. It did not gain a foothold on the popular stage until the arrival of Kiao Yu, whose first play, Liu, that means thunderstorm, a tale of fatalism, retribution, and incestual relations among members of a rich industrialist family, met with phenomenal success. It was followed over the next several years by other critically and popularly acclaimed plays, including Rishu, that means sunrise, Wan Ye, that means wilderness, all of which examined pressing social issues and universal human frailties with gripping tension and innovative dramaturgy. Dear students, now I will be going to tell you something about the war years, like the literary developments which took place from 1937 to 1949. During the Sino-Japanese War, most writers fled to the interior, and that war took place from 1937 to 1945. And the writers who fled to the interior, where they contributed to the war effort by writing patriotic literature under the banner of the Zhonghua Kuanggu Wenzi Kanadi Zihui. That means All China Anti-Japanese Federation of Writers and Artists, which was established in 1938 and directed by Lao Shi. All genres were represented, including reportage, the enormously influential type of writing that was a natural outgrowth of the Federation's call for writers to go to the countryside and the front lines. Literary magazines were filled with short, easily produced and adaptable plays, topical patriotic verse, and war zone dispatches. Among the major writers who continued to produce work of high quality during this period were Bazin, Cao Yu, and Mao Dun. The short stories and novels that Shah Ding wrote in the late 1930s and mid 1940s also received acclaim from fellow writers. The growing dissatisfaction of intellectuals with the nationalist government in Chongqing surfaced dramatically during the civil war that raged throughout China following Japan's surrender, ending with the nationalist retreat to Taiwan and the establishment in October 1949 of the People's Republic of China. Most writers, feeling intense pride and welcoming the challenge, chose to remain on the mainland and serve the new government. The development of literature from 1949 to 76. Literature on the China mainland from 1949 through much of the 1970s was largely a reflection of political campaigns and ideological battles. This state of affairs can be traced to Mao Zedong's 1942 Zai Yan An Wenzi Zhu Tang Hui Shang Di Zhang Yua. That means talks at the Yan'an Forum on Literature and Art, in which he articulated his position that literature, which existed to serve politics, was to be popularized, while the people's level of literacy appreciation was gradually being elevated. Mao's call for a truly proletarian literature written by and for workers, peasants, and soldiers gave rise to a series of rectification campaigns that further defined and consolidated party control over literary activities. In 1949, the first National Congress of Writers and Artists was convened, and the All China Federation of Literature and Art Circles was founded, with Gu Muro elected as its first chairman. Mao's literary ideals had first been realized in the 1940s by Zhao Shuli, whose early stories such as Li Wokai Banhua, the rhymes of Li Wokai, were models of proletarian literature, both in form and in content. As the Civil War neared its conclusion, novels of land reform such as Ding Ling's Presuing Taiwan Zhao Zai Shangyan Sang, that means sun shines over the Shangyan River, and Bafeng Zoyu, that means the hurricane by Zhu Libo, became quite popular. Few of the established May 4th writers continued to produce fiction after 1949. For their experience as social critic did not prepare them for socialist realism, a method of composition borrowed from the Soviet Union, according to which society is described as it should be, not necessarily as it is. During the mid-1950s, an experiment in liberalization, the 100 Flowers campaign was abruptly terminated as criticism of the party went beyond all expectations. It was followed by an anti-rightist movement that purged the cultural ranks of most pre-liberation writers and artists and deprived many young writers such as Liu Binyan and Wang Meng of their freedom to write. The literary nadir, however, was not reached until the Cultural Revolution, which went from 1966 to 1976, when the only literature available was a few carefully screened works by Lu Xun, a handful of model revolutionary operas known as Yang Bangxi, and the revolutionary romantic novels of Hao Ran. After the Cultural Revolution, the accusatory scar literature, a sort of national catharsis that immediately followed the 10-year Holocaust, gave way to more professional and more daring writing, as exemplified in the stories of Wang Meng, with their stylistic experiments in stream of consciousness, and of Bai Hua with their sharp political criticism of the previous 20 years. The symbolic obscure poetry of Bai Dao and others, and relatively bold dramas both for the stage and for the screen of several playwrights such as Gao Xingjian, who, after becoming a French citizen in 1994, won the Nobel Prize for Literature in 2000. Compared with the active literary scene of the early 1980s, when almost every important literary magazine published more than 1 million copies, the late 1980s saw the beginning of a decline in the influence of literature in society. Nevertheless, the overall scale of literary activity remained large. Older writers such as Wang Xingqi and Gao Xiangxiang, the latter's short stories about Chen Wuxiang, a simple and honest peasant met with success, continued to write, while younger writers emerged such as Mo Yan, Wang Annie, and others, who gained a literary reputation, especially if I talk about Mo Yan, with his fanciful story Toming de Hong Liu Buyo, that means the diaphanous red radish. The literature in Taiwan after 1949. The first decade of literary activities in Taiwan after 1949 was characterized by stereotypical anti-communist fiction and drippingly sentimental essays and poetry, producing little memorable literature other than novels such as Yang Ko, that means the rice proud song by Chiang Ai-ling, a story of peasant life under communist rule, and Huyan Fiang, the Wild Wind, Chiang Qiu's novel of power struggles in Shandong. In the 1960s, however, a group of Taiwan University students ushered in the modernist era by publishing their own craftsman-like stories, which were heavily indebted to such Western masters like Franz Kafka, James Joyce, and Virginia Woolf. Many of these writers, such as Pai Zhen-Yuan, author of Wo Yuan Chiang Meng, that means wandering in the garden, walking from a dream, remained influential into the 21st century. Finally, these poets, while not widely accepted by the reading public, strongly influenced the more accessible poets who followed. The late 1960s witnessed the rise of regional writing, in which the Taiwanese countryside served as the setting for fiction and poetry that effectively captured the dramatic social and psychological effects of transition from a rural to an urban-based society. Huang Chuoming's Niziu Yi Si Lao Mao, that means the drowning of an old cat, is representative of this nativist school, which in later years gave way to a more nationalistic literature that reflected Taiwan's current political situation. I would like to end my lecture by saying that in modern Chinese literature we find various layers starting from 1918 onwards, and still that legacy is continuing. And also here we can incorporate the literary developments which took place in Taiwan and still which is having its impact over the society and also on the intellectuals. We need to understand the growth and development of modern Chinese literature as a whole, where we are not only finding the Western influences, also we are getting an idea like how it ushered or welcomed traditional Chinese values and ethos. I hope students definitely like my lecture about modern Chinese literature, where I have tried to show the transition of modern Chinese literature through the ages, especially giving emphasis to 20th century, but definitely it is carrying the legacy from the past. Thank you.